Hi, my name's Elizabeth Gronke, and this is another Folk Art Reflections video visit. I'm so glad you're watching. So, I work at the American Folk Art Museum as an access educator, which means I have the very fun job of looking through the museum's collection and their amazing exhibits and figuring out themes and ideas to bring to you. So, today I want to look at portraits. There are so many different kinds of portraits. Some of them are very traditional, and you're going to see what you would expect, a person seated, holding an object, something like that. You're also going to see some portraits that are a little different. Some that maybe you can't even find the image of the person right away. It's going to be fun to look for different types of portraits together. And I want you to start thinking about if you had a portrait done of yourself, what would you want? What would be important for the world to know about you? So today we're going to start with the museum's one of their most famous pieces of art. I think you might recognize it. Here it is. This is a much loved painting. It's called Girl in Red Dress with Cat and Dog. It's by a portrait artist named Phillips. Now, before I tell you much more about it, just take a look and think about what do you see? What are you noticing? Can you see what makes this painting so beloved? I think it has a lot to do with the bright contrast of that red dress on the dark background. And personally, I also like the look on the face of this little girl and the gentle way that she's holding this white cat. And I have to ask, can you find the dog? The dog is in the lower left-hand corner near her feet, and you can only see the head and the front paw of this very sweet-looking dog who's looking right at the viewer. What are some other details that you notice about this portrait? Sometimes people talk about her necklace. Sometimes people talk about the way the dress fits her. If you want, you can pause the video and point them out to each other. Point out the things you're noticing. Phillips was painting in the early 1800s up until the mid 1800s in an area near Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, along that border. And he had to move around. He was an itinerant portrait painter. There were many of these around in the days, especially the days before photography. And a lot of these portrait artists didn't sign their work. That sort of wasn't the point of the portrait. The point was to have a marker of the family or the child or an individual at a certain time in their lives. And so sometimes people had portraits made by Phillips sitting in their attic and they didn't even know it. There's some good stories that I'm going to direct you to a link on our website, the museum's website, and you can learn more about Phillips. But I have a question for you. So we know that Phillips was pretty successful because he continued to get work even after photography became really available to families as a means of recording what their family looked like at a certain time. So, what would you do if you had the choice of getting your portrait done by someone like Phillips or getting a photograph taken of you? What would you prefer? Just think about it. There's no right or wrong answer. Let's take one more look at Girl in Red Dress with Cat and Dog before we move on. As I said, I've put a link below so that you can learn what the collectors and curators and art historians have learned about the painter and about this painting. But I'm not a curator and I'm not an art historian. And just because I am who I am, I can't help but look at this little girl and start to imagine who was the real girl that was the subject of this painting. How did she feel about having her hair combed flat and parted in the middle? How did she feel about that dress all fluffed out? How did she feel about the necklace? Did she love it? Did she hate it? I just can't help but start imagining who this little girl was. And then I can't help but go even farther and wonder, what name would I give this girl if she was mine to name? What do you think this little girl's name is? You can make it up. It's okay. We won't get in trouble. What name would you give her? If you want to, you can pause the video and tell someone you're sitting with, what is this little girl's name? Also, you could name her cat. You could name her dog. You could wonder, is the dog feeling sad because the cat is clearly the preferred pet? Just kidding. Who knows? Who knows? It's fun to speculate, and that's, for me, one of the joys of looking at a portrait, is starting to let my imagination go into the painting and connect with its subject. Now, not all portraits are formal seated figures. I'm about to show you another painting that at first glance is completely abstract. Ready? Now, before I tell you anything about this painting or the artist, I want you to just look at it. Just let your gaze roam around and notice the colors that were used. Notice the different brush strokes. And see if you have any associations with it. Does it look like something that you recognize? What are you noticing? Which parts of this painting is interesting to you? I'll tell you the title of this painting, which tells us quite a lot. The title is Abstract with Photograph of Artist. It's by Clementine Hunter. Did you see the photograph in the center of the painting? I'm going to zoom in now so you can see that photograph. You see her? She's actually holding one of her paintings in this photograph. It's a painting in a painting. Clementine Hunter was a pretty interesting lady. She was born in the 1880s in Louisiana and lived and worked in her small town and lived up until almost 100. So she passed away in the 1980s. And her paintings, she didn't start painting until she was in her midlife. And she usually painted scenes of her small town, things like baptisms and people working. So this painting that we're looking at is quite different. Let's go back to looking at the whole painting. Now that you know that there's a photograph of the artist in the center and that makes this a self-portrait, does that change the way that you see this in any way? Do you feel differently about the colors, knowing that she's put an image of herself in the middle? What could all those colors mean? Maybe as an expression or an expansion of who she is, or maybe the world around her. I wonder if we could use our imaginations again and imagine that we're borrowing this artist's technique. If you were to place a small photograph of yourself in the center of a canvas, think about what colors and textures you would like to surround yourself in. It's very liberating for me to realize that it could be as abstract as this painting. It doesn't have to be fully understood or spelled out visually. It can just be shapes and colors and brush strokes. What would you want? Can you imagine what your portrait done in this style might look like? If it's something that you have the materials for at your home, to make a photocopy of yourself in the center of a page and to expand that image into color, it would be really a fun project to try. If you do try it at home, I hope that you'll feel liberated and inspired by Clementine Hunter's freedom with color and freedom to do an abstract painting, even though that wasn't her usual technique. Now, speaking of artists who are inspired by other artists, I want to introduce you to a fairly young contemporary artist. He's only in his 30s, but he's in the Folk Art Museum because he chooses an art medium that's traditionally considered a folk art medium, quilting. And he's made a self-portrait, many self-portraits in fact, through the medium of quilting. Are you intrigued? Here it is. Yes, this is a quilt. It's made out of fabric and thread, just like any quilt. Every single piece is a piece of fabric. It's about 7.5 feet long. It's called Self-Portrait Number 7, Over Here, and it's by the artist Luke Haynes. It was in a show at the museum called Alt Quilts. That was in 2013. And that exhibition showed contemporary artists who are inspired by folk art traditions of quilting. So they showed historical quilts next to these very modern quilts. Now take a look at this quilt. What do you think? What's your opinion? It's a very different color palette than what we've seen. It's very geometric in most of it. And did you notice the way the face looks sort of stretched out? It's a technique that's pretty clever. It's called anamorphic perspective, which means that when you look at it straight on, it looks stretched, but when you look from just the right angle, it looks normal. What would you do if someone put your face on a quilt? How would you feel about it? Would you like it? And if you did ask Luke Haynes to make a portrait of you on the large quilt, would you want to hang it on your wall? Or would you want to put it on your bed? It's a question. What is a quilt for? And what is a portrait for? It's an intriguing question to me. What is a portrait for? Is it simply to have a record of a person? Like a snapshot? Or is it to delve into something deeper, like their feelings or their outlook on life? Well, let's keep investigating. I have one more type of portraiture I want to share with you, and this was a style of portraiture that was popular about 200 years ago. Are you familiar with this type of portrait? Have you seen things like this before? It's called a silhouette portrait. And as you can see, this depicts a man and a woman with a flower wreath framing them. The artist is unknown. And I'm curious, what do you think of this style of portraiture? And what do you think would be the occasion for this sort of portrait? Even though it's just black and white, it definitely captures the hairstyles and the clothing from the time it was made. What do you think about it? What I like about this is the way the silhouetted pair shows their relationship to each other. Just by being placed in the same frame and facing each other, I imagine that they were a couple and that this portrait was meant to signify a token of their marriage, perhaps. Why else might a portrait like this get made? And more importantly, Would you want a silhouette portrait made of you? So we've seen some of the reasons for portraiture. We've seen that a portrait can be a token of a milestone in life, like perhaps this silhouette is. Or it can be a bold statement in contemporary art, like Luke Haynes's work. Or it can be a self-made portrait full of expression through texture and color, and maybe even some hidden symbols inside. And portraits can be traditional, like Girl in Red Dress with Cat and Dog, which could capture the likeness of a person and hopefully something of that person's spirit too. I hope I've given you something interesting to think about, including what kind of portrait you would make of yourself. And that is my challenge for you this week. If you can, with a partner, have a portrait of yourself taken by photograph. Most of us have one of these miraculous phone devices with us that serve multifunctions. So if they can take a photograph of you, you could be seated, you could grab a few objects that represent some important aspects of who you are and light yourself beautifully and take a photographic portrait of yourself. I would love to see it if you're willing to share. So you can email me at the following email address. And as always, check out what's on the museum's website. We always have something new and interesting for you because we all need something new and interesting to look at. Thank you for visiting me, and I look forward to our next video visit.